Good morning, everybody. Excited to be here. We're in this identity series where we've been kind of digging into the core values of Revision Church. We're looking at how we're going to live out who God created us to be. And I'm excited this morning because we're taking a look at one of these values that I think is absolutely fundamental to who we are as individuals and critical to our life as a community. And it's this: created people connect to the Creator. Created people connect to the Creator. See, part of our identity is, as human beings, is that we're creatures. We're beings created by a creative Creator. And that Creator creatively created us for connection. Say that 5 times fast. God wired us for connection with Him. He wired us for worship. And I'm convinced that sometimes in the midst of the busyness of life, in the midst of all the craziness of doing faith and doing all the other stuff that we do and checking off the boxes of being a good Christian and doing the stuff that we believe that God has asked us and invited us into, this is something that gets frequently missed. I mean, we go to worship services, but we don't always really worship. And if we have a real honest moment, we don't always know exactly what the word worship means. We don't even know what we mean sometimes when we say the word worship. I mean, it's a churchy word. You come to church and you hear the word worship a lot. And maybe we've used the word a lot without having a lot of clarity about what exactly we mean, what exactly we're describing, what exactly we're talking about when we talk about worship. I think too often that word in our culture and in our practice and the way we do life and faith in church, too often the word worship gets reduced to this idea of coming somewhere on a Sunday morning and kind of standing around and silently mouthing words while some band plays some songs, and occasionally feeling happy while that's going on, occasionally feeling distracted while that's going on, and occasionally just thinking about how soon we're going to sit down while that's going on. Unless you're at Mass and you're thinking about whether you're going to stay seated because the calisthenics are too much. I can't stay in the I've asked. I can't do that without my inhaler. But I think sometimes we get confused about what worship is because it's this ambiguous term that doesn't have a really clear definition in our hearts and our minds and the practice of the church. And sometimes I think we miss out on worship. We miss out on the fullness of living out this life that God's inviting us into as created people, this connection that God wired us for, because we just don't feel worthy. Like we look at ourselves in the mirror, we don't feel like we're good enough or special enough or Christian enough to actually enter into the presence of God. We take a look at ourselves and our brokenness and our pain and our sin, and we feel like, man, there's no way that God's really inviting me in. Like I'm not good enough. I'm too messed up. I'm too broken. I'm too unworthy to enter into the presence of God. Like as I am, God couldn't possibly want to connect with me. There's no, like maybe God created some people, but I'm just not a good enough Christian. I'm not a good enough human being to enter into the presence of God. That can't be me. I don't fit the bill. There's this scene in the movie Despicable Me where the criminal mastermind Gru has adopted 3 daughters to help him pull off his next great plot. And when he gets them home, this is what happens. Check it out.
Can I hold your hand? When we got adopted by a bald guy, I thought this would be more like Annie.
Kyle, these are not treats. These are guests. Girls, this is Kyle, my dog.
Ooh, fluffy dumpy.
What kind of dog is that?
These are... I don't know.
Do you really think this is an appropriate place for little kids? Because, it's not.
No! Stay away from their distraction! Well, I suppose the plan will work with 2. provided everything a child might need. Okay. As I was saying, hey, off!
Somebody broke that.
Okay. Clearly, we need to set some rules. Rule number 1: you will not touch anything.
What about the floor?
Yes, you may touch the floor.
What about the air?
Yes, you may touch the air.
What about this?
Where did you get that?
Found it.
Okay, rule number 2, you will not bother me while I'm working. Rule number 3, you will not cry, or whine, or laugh, or giggle, or sneeze, or burp, or fart. So, no annoying sounds, right?
Does this count as annoying?
Very.
This is the scene where Gru adopts these girls, and he's laying out the ground rules for them. Like he lays out some pretty severe conditions, like don't be yourself, stop making noises, don't touch anything, and it's almost like he doesn't want them. Like you get the impression really quickly that Gru does not love these kids, and they figure it out, right? Because he sets all these rules and all these conditions and all these. He paints a pretty severe picture of what it looks like and what it requires of them in order to come into his home, in order to come into his presence. I think sometimes in any situation where there's a lot of rules and a lot of regulations, we get the idea that we are not really being invited in. I have that idea about tomorrow night. Like we're one day away from the caucuses. Have you read about those? There's like you got to go to the right spot. You got to pre-register. The Republicans do it one way. The Democrats do it another way. I majored in political science, and I read about what the caucuses look like and think, I'm not sure they want me there. If they did, they would make it a lot simpler. But here's the thing. I think when it comes to worship, we tend to see worship sometimes the way that those 3 girls saw Gru. We tend to see it the way we see the caucuses. Like maybe it's this big, really complex thing with a lot of rules and a lot of regulations, and we got to learn to do it right, because if we don't do it right, God can't possibly meet with us, or God wouldn't possibly invite us in. And so sometimes we avoid the concept entirely because we want to learn the right words. Or you feel like, oh man, it's complex. Like I couldn't possibly do it. I got to learn all the methodologies. I got to learn the catchphrases first. Or you feel like we got to get ourselves right. Like until I get myself right with God, until I get my life figured out and lined up, I can't possibly enter into His presence. But here's the thing: waiting to come to God until you've been perfected is like waiting to go to the hospital until the bleeding stops. And there are no magic words. Instead, like right where you are, right here, right now, in the middle of your mess, God simply says, come. He's inviting you here and now to live out your identity as a created person by connecting with Him. If you have your Bibles this morning, you can open them up to Psalm 95. This is right about dead center. And I love this poem. It's a famous psalm known as the Venita, because it begins with the word come. Come. And here's the psalmist who writes this word, come, but understand that this invitation to come is God's invitation. It's His invitation to you and to me and to us. And historically, over the last 2,000 years, this psalm, the Venita, has been the single passage of Scripture that most shaped the understanding and the practice of worship in the church. And we're going to dig into it this morning to help us answer just a few questions that I think will give us a clue as to how God is inviting us to live out our identity as created people. We want to ask, what is worship? Why should I worship? And how do I worship? And this psalm provides us with some powerful answers. So this is what Psalm 95 says. It says, come, let us sing for joy to the Lord. Let us shout aloud to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before Him with thanksgiving and extol Him with music and song. For the Lord is the great God, the great King above all gods. In His hand are the depths of the earth, and the mountain peaks belong to Him. The sea is His, for He made it, and His hands formed the dry land. Come, let us bow down in worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for He is our God. And we are the people of His pasture, the flock under His care. Today, if only you would hear His voice. Do not harden your hearts as you did at Meribah, as you did that day at Massa in the wilderness, where your ancestors tested me, they tried me. Though they had seen what I did, for 40 years I was angry with that generation. I said, they are a people whose hearts go astray, and they have not known my ways. So I declared an oath in my anger, they shall never enter my rest. So what is worship? Well, the word worship basically means to bow before something. And the way that it's used in this passage specifically means this posture of bowing that is ascribing ultimate value to something in a way that involves all of who you are. And so worship is this posture of bowing, not just physically bowing, bowing yourself and your will and your emotions, all of who you are, before something or someone. It's this holistic devotion of our entire selves to someone or something that we have decided is the most important one or thing. That's what the word worship means. And Psalm 95 kind of paints this picture for us of what worship looks like. And paints this picture of worship that is so much bigger and so much fuller than what we've reduced the word worship to mean in our 21st century Western church context. It paints a picture of worship being about all of ourselves. Every bit of every piece of who we are being engaged in worship. And verse 1 talks about singing and song, about this idea of engaging our emotions and our feelings in the process of worship, of surrendering to this one or thing that we find most valuable. And then verse 6 talks about bowing down physically, which is a symbol of just surrendering our wills. And then verse 8 talks about remembering, thinking about the truth of who God is and what God has done. It talks about like the things that God has accomplished in the world. It's talking about engaging our minds in worship. This sense that worship is about every bit of us. Our minds and our hearts and our emotions and our feelings and our thoughts and our wills. Just this complete surrender of every part of our lives to this person or this thing to which we have ascribed ultimate value. I know some people hear that. I've talked with people in the church. I've talked with leaders in the church who hear that idea that worship is about every part of us. It's about engaging our will and our emotions and our minds. And they say, yeah, well, I don't really like to sing. I don't really like to sing. Music is not for me. The feeling part of it is not for me. Like, I stand there, I tolerate it, I mumble along sometimes to the words, but like, you don't want me to sing anyway, I'm tone deaf. Pursuing God is just more of an intellectual thing for me than a feeling thing. But I have a news flash, right? If you're one of those people who wants to say, like, I don't get into the touchy-feely, emotional stuff, that hand-raising weirdo, feelings, but it's just a pursuit of my mind. Like, if you can come into worship and it doesn't absolutely shake you to your core, if the presence of God in the room doesn't change the way that you feel, if it doesn't move your heart just as much as it moves your mind, then you've experienced something I like to call a worship fail. You did it wrong, okay? You did it wrong. Flip that around. Some of us love to sing, right? Some of us are tone deaf and we don't know it. Some of us aren't tone deaf. We just like music and we love to sing. We get there on Sunday morning, we stand up and we shout it out and it's fun and we feel our feelings like all over the place. We feel them all over everybody around us. But I want you to understand too, like, if those feelings, if that experience of worship doesn't change the way that you think, and then subsequently change the way that you live your life, you've had another worship fail. You did it wrong. Like the worship that God's inviting us into, what it looks like to live our identity as created people connecting with our Creator, is this place where we come and offer every bit of ourselves. Every part of who we are as human beings and as individuals to God. Because worship is about bowing all of who you are before the person or thing to which you've ascribed ultimate value. So the second question is why? Why do it? Okay, that's what worship is, but why should we worship? Or why specifically should we worship God? Or more to the point of this day, like, why should created people connect to the Creator? And put simply, with no beating around the bush, we should worship God because we really only have two options. Worship the wrong thing or worship the only one who's worthy. I know we don't like that. Right? I say, like, we only have two options, and something inside of us gets really frustrated because we live in this liberated American Enlightenment society where we believe we have free choice and free will and we can choose whatever we want. We don't like dichotomies. We say, like, well, there's only two options. And so we want to believe in our modern conscience that we don't have to worship anything. That we get to choose, right? I can choose to worship something. I can choose to worship whatever I want, or I can choose not to worship anything. Can't I? Can I? No. You can't. It's just not possible. It's part of being a human being. It's part of the way we're wired. You will ascribe ultimate value to something. You will put something on the throne of your life. You already have. Something is there in your life. Something's there in my life too. It's unavoidable. I think we can only truly understand what God is inviting us into in worship, what God's inviting us into as he asks us to connect with him when we come to the place of admitting that there is something sitting on the throne of our hearts and our lives. There's something in each one of us, in each one of our lives that's most important, most valuable, most loved. Because there is. I think the cool part about that is that we can recognize worship isn't actually an unnatural thing. Worship isn't one of those weird things where we have to change around our lives or change around who we are to experience it and understand it. Worship comes naturally to us as human beings. As much as people in our culture and our world want to say, I don't do that. I don't worship anything. I'm not religious. That's not part of my life. That's not kind of who I am. That's not what I do. It's not true. It's natural for us to put something, to ascribe ultimate value to something. And the question that each one of us has to ask is, what is it for me? What is it in my life that I've ascribed ultimate value to? And it may be an uncomfortable question to ask, but it's probably not hard to answer. Let me ask you this. If your life got turned into a reality show, if TV cameras followed you 24/7, what would the people you've never met who watch that show say is most important to you? What does your life reflect as being the thing to which you've ascribed ultimate value? That's a really interesting one to think through. Again, maybe not comfortable, but it's an interesting thing to think through. What would people say is most important to you? Because that's your answer. I think about that culturally too, right? If aliens, I like to picture them as green. You can picture them however you want. But if green aliens landed on a Sunday morning in America, right? And they had no idea what we're about, what our culture does, and they're like, all right, let's check these weird earthlings out, let's see what they're about. And so at about 8 a.m., they noticed that somewhere between 13 and 15% of the population woke up a little bit early, went to this place, sang for a little bit, sat for a little bit, and then went home. And then threw on jerseys and turned on their TVs and started screaming at the TV to arenas full of screaming, yelling, excited, happy, cheering people who are all dressed the same, yelling at the little guys running around on a field. What do you think the aliens would say America worships? If they had to fill in the blank for the alien headmaster. On Sundays, America worships. I bet it would be football, not Jesus. But that's my guess, right? In the early part of the Harry Potter series, and I'm going to admit something, maybe some of you are potheads, that's what I like to call people that like that show. But anyway, some of you are potheads, I'm not. I've never actually read any of the books fully, I've never seen any of the movies, but I've sat through a lot of them while doing other stuff by way of being a good husband. Let's try and be near Jenny while she watches things that I don't like, so that it counts as quality time together. And I've sat through that, but I picked out parts of the story. There's these parts that I remember, and one of them is really, really profound. It's one of the early books. There's this time when Harry goes into some room, right, and he looks in this mirror. It's called the Mirror of Erised, which is desire spelled backwards, because J.K. Rowling's a really creative writer. So anyways, he looks into this mirror and he sees this scene, right? And it's his mom and his dad, who he never met, or he doesn't have any memory of, and they're just loving him. They're this great family. And Harry gets really excited, so he runs and he finds his friend Ron to go show him this incredible scene of his parents loving him. And then Ron looks in the mirror and Ron sees Ron as some Quidditch sports hero that all the ladies love. And they both get really confused. He was like, no, that's not what I'm looking at. And so they go find Dumbledore, I think that's the principal's name, and they're like, what's happening here? And he tells them that this mirror is this special magical mirror in which anyone who looks in sees the thing that their heart desires most. That's why Ron sees Ron being a ladies' man, and Harry sees this family that he never has. And then Dumbledore says something really interesting. It's the reason that this scene jumped out, the reason that I remember it. He says, we're getting rid of it. People waste away in front of it. I think that's profound, because in some ways it's an uncomfortable look into the depths of the human condition. Everybody sees something. Everybody has something that they want, more than they want anything else. And too many people waste away chasing after things that aren't worthy, that aren't worth it. Chasing after things that aren't the one they were created to worship. think it's easy to do. I know it's easy to do, like in my own life. Part of the reason that it's easy for us to waste our lives away chasing after things that aren't worth worshiping is that we tend in our lives and in our minds to minimize God, to minimize His greatness, and to maximize the stuff that we want. Like we look out at the world and we tend to think that that stuff, if we really get it, is better and is going to be more fulfilling than it really is. So we minimize God and we maximize the stuff of the world. And sometimes we need just a reminder of who God is. We need a vision and a picture of what He is and what He's about in the world. And there's one found in Isaiah chapter 6. Isaiah has this encounter with God and he writes about it in chapter 6. This is what Isaiah says. It says, "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of His robe filled the temple. Above Him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, 'Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of His glory.' And at the sound of their voices, the doorposts and the threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. 'Woe to me,' I cried, 'I am ruined. For I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty.' Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hand, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. And he touched it to my mouth and said, 'See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for.' And then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Whom shall I send? Who will go for us?' And I said, 'Here I am, send me.'" And here Isaiah sees a glimpse of just the presence of God. He doesn't even see God Himself. He just sees a glimpse of the presence of God. He is just so overcome and so overwhelmed by the majesty and the holiness and the power and just the radical otherness of God that he falls on his face and says, "I'm dead. I'm dead. I'm messed up. I'm imperfect. I'm sinful. My culture is sinful. My people are sinful. I am a dead man." I mean, he didn't even see God. And he couldn't have handled it if he did, but he didn't see God. And he realized just with this glimpse of the presence of God, that God is so powerful and so holy and so other that he was a dead man for even seeing it. And he didn't need to see God because he saw that the angels weren't even looking. And he saw that the train of God's robe filled the whole temple, and that communicated everything to Isaiah that Isaiah needed to know. And for us, that doesn't make a lot of sense because we're not big on trains. But here's what we got to understand: since the ancient world, right? The length of someone's train reflected the measure of their power. And so long trains on a road were reserved for the greatest and most powerful of kings. And that custom kind of still lives on across the pond. Like if you look at Kate Middleton's wedding dress when she got married to Prince William, right? She had kind of a long train. Or Princess Diana had a famous one. Like Princess Diana's train covered half of the aisle of Westminster Abbey when she got married. And the reason she had that long of a train was to communicate just who was getting married. The king, the future king of England, Charles and Diana were getting married. And that train communicated her importance and Charles' importance. And so when Isaiah gets this, he lives in a culture that understands that. So when Isaiah sees God's train filling the room, he understands something. He understands that it is power beyond comprehension that's represented by that long train. He's overcome. He's afraid. Like he's just absolutely terrified, and rightly so. I think sometimes our modern sensibilities tend to be offended by this idea of the fear of God. Right? Because we want God to be our BFF and our buddy and our bae, and he's like our good friend. And like, you know, and it's hard to like fear someone who's supposed to be like close to you. And like, how do you accept someone to your heart who you fear? But the Bible doesn't shy away from talking about being afraid of God, or from this healthy respect and fear of the Lord. Proverbs 1:7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction." Acts 9:31 says, "The church throughout Judea, Galilee, and Samaria enjoyed a time of peace and was strengthened, living in fear of the Lord and encouraged by the Holy Spirit, and increased in numbers." In fact, the Bible talks about this concept of the fear of the Lord, this awe and wonder, this respect, over 100 times. And there are a couple hundred other times in the Bible where it mentions God and fear in the same sentence. But here's what's happened in our culture. We've minimized the distance between us and God. We've come to the point where we're pretty puffed up, pretty convinced of our own greatness, or at least our own general goodness. We look at ourselves and we see ourselves as pretty good. And frankly, we see ourselves as better than we are. And we have at the same time emphasized God's nearness And that's really good. It's really important because God reveals himself from the beginning of the scriptures to the end. He's this God who is not just transcendent, but he's immanent, he's real, he's present in our lives. But in our sin and in our selfishness, at the same time that we've puffed ourselves up, we found a God who is not only near, but a God who's impotent. We've come to this place culturally where we believe that God is just basically a little bit better version of us. Like just a little bit further down the road of life and the road of spirituality, he's just kind of a guru. And so we've created this God in our minds that is a God who looks pretty much like us. And what we've done is puffed ourselves up and shrunk God at the same time. And sometimes we need to be reminded of what Isaiah saw. We need to be reminded that he's not. That he is holy and powerful and mighty and worthy beyond our ability to comprehend, and that he is radically other. He's radically other, but he invites us to come. He invites us to come. John had a vision really similar to Isaiah's vision. He had a vision of Jesus in Revelation chapter 1, and he writes this. He says, "When I saw him, I fell at his feet, though dead. Then he placed his right hand on me and said, 'Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last. I am the living one. I was dead, and now look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys to death and Hades.'" And this idea that John would fall on his face in just this mortified fear and awe of Jesus, like that he would fall at Jesus' feet, is not surprising. I'm convinced that if any one of us in this room had an experience similar to the experience that Isaiah had, similar to the experience that John had, like if we saw that vision, we couldn't help but do the same. We would fall at the feet of a holy God. But it's Jesus' response to John when he falls that just takes my breath away. John describes a scene where he falls at the feet of this holy God who just blows his mind. And then what Jesus does is he kneels. And he places his hand on John. He says, "Do not be afraid." Who is this God? Who is this God who's holy and radically other than us and powerful beyond our comprehension, but who at the same time invites us to come? See, what John discovered in this vision is this God is the first and the last. He's the creator of all things, but he's also the God who laid aside, who set aside all of his splendor so that he could reconcile us, so that he could be with us despite our brokenness. And that's what worship is about. That's what worship is about. It's about understanding that God is holy and he's worthy, but at the same time, he is near and he is love. Like we need to understand both of those if we're going to fully worship. We need to grasp God's radical otherness and God's incredible, passionate nearness if we're going to understand worship. I'm convinced of this. I've become absolutely convinced at the core of who I am of this. Our capacity for worship is determined by our understanding of the gap that exists between our sin and God's holiness. Our capacity for worship is determined by our understanding of the gap that exists between our sin and God's holiness. Because when we minimize it, right, when we puff ourselves up, when we see ourselves as better than we are, when we forget that God is holy and radically other, and we see him as just a little bit more like us and a little bit closer, then our capacity for worship shrinks. Our ability to truly enter into the presence of God and understand who he is and what he wants for us shrinks when we puff ourselves up and we minimize God. But when we understand the gap that exists between our sin and God's holiness, our capacity for worship dramatically increases. And it increases because in that moment, we see God for who he really is. And we understand just what it meant and just how far he came to be with us. That's why we worship. So the last question is, how do we worship? And I got 4 simple, quick tools from this passage. The first one is that we worship in community. In Psalm 95, if you read it, it's all plural. There's never anything about me worshiping or I worshiping or any singular noun or verbs. It's all about us, what we do together. It's about corporate worship. And God promises us. Jesus says, wherever 2 or 3 gather in my name, there I am in their midst. In the presence of God, that's the powerful stuff. That's the stuff that transforms lives. I know, again, the idea of worshiping in community, having to do anything in community, kind of cuts against the grain of our Western, individualistic, self-centered mindset. But the truth is this, you will never know God fully as he is outside of community, because God reveals himself as community and God reveals himself in community. And that doesn't mean you can't submit to God on your own. It doesn't mean that everything you do, every bit or every action of your day can't be worshipful. As you submit who you are, as you bow before the King, you can and you should. But it means you're going to miss out on the fullness of what God's inviting you into if you try and do it without community. And the second way that we worship God is in truth. We worship because truth exists, because God is who God is, because God has done what God has done. And this passage just reminds us of the mightiness of God, that God is the creator of the universe, and that truth exists not as I want it to be or not as you want it to be, but as it is. And so we can worship God because of who God is and because of what God has done. And again, in this self-worshiping, relativistic culture, I think that's why worship has become such a foreign concept. Because true worship is about understanding truth rightly. It's about getting that right picture of who God is and who we are. It's about embracing that reality and surrendering ourselves to Him. And sometimes I think we're too cool for that. Sometimes I look at my own life and I just think like, I'm too self-centered, I'm too proud, I'm too cool to really look at myself and God and see the gap. I'm reminded of this story in Luke where this prostitute basically comes. And Jesus is eating with the Pharisees at one of their houses, and she comes and she has this vat of expensive oil. And she pours it out over Jesus' feet. She starts rubbing and washing his feet with her hair. And one of the Pharisees, the guy who owns the house, is just horrified. He's like, Jesus, how could you let her do that? Like, how could you let her waste that expensive bottle of perfume, that expensive bottle of oil on your feet? And Jesus tells him a parable about two people who had a debt. One had a small debt and it was forgiven. The other had a giant debt that the king wiped out. And Jesus asked the Pharisee, who do you think was more thankful? And the Pharisee answers him rightly. He says, well, the one who had the greater debt was more thankful. And Jesus looks and says, yeah, that's what she's doing. She understands the depths of her debt in a way that you don't. Like, she sees the gap. And I'm forced to wonder sometimes, like, if Jesus walked in here today, whether I'd be more like the Pharisee or whether I'd be more like that woman. Whether I would treat him more like a compatriot, a companion, someone who's pretty close to me, maybe a little better. Whether I'd see myself as greater than I am, or whether I'd be able, like the woman, to just worship with reckless abandon because I understand the gap, because I understand the depth of my debt to God. And the third way we worship is in spirit, right? The word spirit isn't found in Psalm 95, but the Psalm's clear. It says over and over and over and over again that worship is about entering into the presence of God. The presence of God. So we worship in spirit because the Spirit is the presence of God with us. And on some level, God's everywhere. You ask the question, isn't God present everywhere? Yes. But our eyes aren't always open to that. Like David writes, cast me not away from your presence. Isaiah writes, rend the heavens and let your presence come down. And so sometimes we forget that worship isn't about us, and it's not about what we do or how we perform. Like I said earlier, it's not about like coming up with the right words or the right catchphrases or the right rituals. It's about God doing something and opening up our eyes. And so when we realize that worship is about worshiping in spirit, that it's about coming into the presence of God as mediated by God Himself, we have a totally different lens of what it looks like. In John 3, John writes that the Spirit is like wind. And in this way, I think that worship is like sailing. Like a sailor can't make the wind. Sailors can only raise the sails and wait for something big to happen when the wind comes. And worshiping in spirit means basically that we come to the point where we can't conjure the presence of God. We can't manipulate God into being here. What we can do is come humbly before a holy God and get ready for something big to happen when the Spirit shows up. And the fourth way we worship, this passage indicates, is we worship in rest. And this is a weirder one for us. Like, we in rest? What does that look like? But Psalm 95 is interesting. You might remember, like, it goes from really upbeat to really serious really fast. Like, it talks about, like, hey, let's come into the presence of God, let's worship Him. And then there's this angry passage, like, God was like, those people rebelled against me, and my anger I swore an oath, they'll never enter my rest. That's weird. It's okay to call the Bible weird sometimes. That's weird. Like, all of a sudden you're like, oh, God, let's worship God. Oh, God is mad. What is going on? Why are those two things sandwiched together? In Hebrews 4 in the New Testament makes a big deal of Psalm 95 ending like that. And the writer of Hebrews asks, like, if the gospel is true, why does Psalm 95 end like that? And what the writer of Hebrews tells us is Psalm 95 ends like that as a reminder to us that worship is not a way of earning our way to God. That we can't do anything about it. That gap is unbridgeable on our own. And we can only worship if we enter into the true rest of understanding the gospel. That God did it for us. The real worship is about entering into this restful place where we realize, where we recognize that He bridged the gap. That we can't earn it, that we can't do it on our own, that we don't have to. That we don't have to be perfect, that we don't have to iron out our lives before we can enter into the presence of God. We can just restfully enter in because God invites us right in the middle of our mess to come. So we are created people, designed to connect to our Creator and worship. It's the deepest purpose of our lives. It's the deepest need of our souls. We believe it. Wherever you are in your journey, wherever it is that you've been, wherever you are now, wherever it is that you want to go or believe that you need to go, worship is the greatest need of your heart. It's what you were created for. Transferring to God that ultimate place of value on the throne of your life and giving yourself, all of who you are, completely to Him because He is the one who is most worthy. That is what God's inviting you into. It's what He created you for. Worshiping in community, in truth, in spirit, and in rest by God's power, not yours. That's what it looks like to live out our identity as created people. And if we don't do it, but if we keep chasing ourselves, if we keep chasing the stuff of the world that we have maximized when we minimize God, that stuff of the world that we've wanted most, whether for you it's power or money or success or fame or achievement or sports or popularity, if you keep worshiping the things other than God, then you're going to miss out on your created purpose and on the fullness of the life you were made to live. And it's easy to do. It is so easy for us to trade what we want now for what we want most. It's easy for us to get to that point where we want something so badly immediately that we give up the things that we want most in order to get it. I think all of us, or at least most of us in the room, would say, yeah, I want God on the throne of my life. Yeah, I want to worship the way I was created to worship. I want to live out my identity as a created person. That's what I want. But I think all of us, too, could come to that point where, like St. Augustine, who struggled with lust, we say, God, make me chaste, just not yet. God, let me put you on the throne of my life, just not yet. Let me get all the other stuff that I'm chasing first, and then I want you, God. And sometimes we want God after we get all the other stuff that's actually on the throne of our lives. Reminds me of a story in the Old Testament where Esau sold his birthright to Jacob for a cup of soup because he was real hungry in the moment. Beware of the temptation to trade what you want most for what you want now. Because if you do, if you're willing to let anything else sit on the throne of your life, even for a minute, what you're doing is trading your birthright. Your right to connect with a Creator who created and wired and designed you for a relationship with Him, who left heaven and left all of His glory and all of His power and His splendor to die on a cross to redeem and reconcile you to Himself. You're trading your birthright to connecting with that God, the God of the universe. You're giving it up for something that is ultimately as worthless to you as a cup of soup. Beware of the temptation to trade what you want most for what you want now. But if we get there, if we come to this point, we come before God with all of ourselves, willing to surrender who we are completely to Him. Willing to bow all of ourselves before His power and His splendor. It changes everything. Like a phone with LTE or a laptop with Wi-Fi, we are built for connection. And it changes everything about who we are. It changes everything about the lens through which we see our world. And it doesn't mean there's never going to be trouble. It doesn't mean there's never going to be pain. We live in this broken world, but I'm convinced of this. I believe it. The greatest answer and the way to make it through all the pain and all the hurt and all the brokenness and all the frustration of this life is not petitionary prayer. The greatest thing we need to make it through all the brokenness of this world isn't coming before God and asking Him. I mean, that's important. I don't want to minimize that, but the greatest way to make it through all that is worship. Is worship. In spirit, in truth, in community. It's connecting to the God who created us for connection with Him. So this morning as the band comes up and sings, I want to invite you to worship. I want to invite you to worship through song during this next worship set. And I want to invite you to worship in a different way too. On the back tables, there are all these thank you cards. And and there's some pins. I just want to invite all of us, you don't have to do it, but during this next song, they're going to play 3 songs. And at some point during the worship set, I want to invite all of us to make our way back and to write a short note to God. Because I think sometimes in the midst of all of what we're doing, we ask a lot of God and we don't spend a lot of time to stop and to thank Him for bridging that gap for us. And so I want to invite us this morning to go back and to write a quick note and to acknowledge, God, you haven't always been on the throne of my life. You haven't always been the thing that I worship. You haven't always been what I wanted most. You haven't been the thing that I'm giving all of myself to. But God, this morning I want to give all of who I am to you. Thank you, God, for it. Thank you for anything. Thank you for everything. Thank you for bridging the gap for you. I just want to invite you to write that and then just tent it. Just leave it on the table as a communal way of all of us saying, as Revision Church, we believe that created people connect to the Creator. And this morning we're going to come before God. We're going to surrender ourselves. We're going to worship Him. We're going to thank Him for who He is and for what He's done to us. Let's pray. God, thank you. Just sometimes in the midst of life and in the midst of doing faith, it's easy to forget just how holy you are, just how giant of a gap you bridged between my sin and your holiness. And it's easy to chase after the stuff that this world says we should chase after. God, I pray for all of us this morning that we quit doing that. That we quit trading what we want now for what we want most. That we quit putting anything else on the throne of our lives because we're missing out on the life that you created us for. On the fullness of what it means to be created people. And so, Lord, we want to put you on the throne this morning. We want to worship you right now. We want to invite you in to blow and move in this place in a way that transforms who we are and how we see the world around us. We're so grateful for who you are and for what you've done. We worship you, Lord. In Jesus' name, amen.